Welcome everyone to 70 Faces. We are going to do chapter 41 tonight. And this is the second in a series about juxtaposition. This is really one of the most important series of methods used by commentators, by the sages, by Hasidic rabbis, by Kabbalists. Last week, we learned about the juxtaposition between Torah portions. Tonight, we're going to learn about juxtaposition of verses. Why is one verse next to another verse? And what do the commentators say? What do we learn from this? And they learn all the way from Jewish law to mysticism, from the juxtaposition of verses. Next week, we'll learn about the juxtaposition of mitzvot. Why is this mitzvah next to that mitzvah? Some of it is obvious, and some of it is far from obvious. It needs a lot of explanation why they seem like completely different subjects. Okay, so we're starting, for those who have the book, on page 381, the first example. And this is going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it says that after they ate from the fruit of the tree, it says that they opened their eyes and realized that they were naked. And they took fig leaves and somehow they made like some kind of a covering with fig leaves. So as part of a whole discussion in the Gemara as to what was the fruit, it never says in the Torah explicitly what the fruit was. And there are, I believe, 4 different opinions given, and each one brings a sort of proof. One of them is not the apple. That's like the proverbial fruit as the apple. And there's in art, especially Christian art, that's the fruit that is chosen. But as far as our tradition, that was not one of the 4. That was not one of the 4. One was wheat. That has a lot to do with Sfira to Omer, that when we bring the Omer offering, it's from barley. But when we get to Shavuos, it's 2 loaves of chametz. It's actually the only time of the year as part of a public offering that chametz is brought on the altar. It's brought in what's called the Toda offering by an individual. Part of the Thanksgiving offering includes chametz, leavened types of bread or crackers. But as public, it's only on Shavuos. And this is very connected with the whole thing of eating from the tree of good and evil. So that's one of the opinions, that the fruit was wheat. Another opinion is that it was an etrog, because an etrog is described as being a beautiful fruit. We know that from Sukkot. It's one of the 4 species. And it says that when Eve saw the fruit, that it was beautiful to the eyes. So that's another opinion. The other opinion was that it was grape and even wine. And this has to do with the whole concept of using grape juice or wine in sanctifying holidays and Shabbat and holy events is a rectification. And the last one is figs. And so Rabbi Nehemiah said, what's his proof that it was figs? So he said that which caused their downfall was then used to rectify them. In other words, the same fruit that caused their downfall, that's what they used to cover themselves up modestly. So that was the proof that he brought. But this is a very, very deep concept, this idea that the very thing that might be our downfall or the cause of a trouble or a curse can be turned around to be the fixing of it. So there's a verse, I believe that we've learned this before, the verse is Eit Sarah LiYaakov. It's a time of trouble for Yaakov, Umimena Yehoshia, and from it he will be saved. So the simple literal translation is, it's a time of trouble for Yaakov, and from that trouble he will be saved. But there are many explanations that go one step deeper and say that it's from the trouble itself that the salvation comes. And you could read it literally, umimena, and from it, meaning the trouble, will come the salvation. So one example, there are many, many types of examples, but one example is if someone, God forbid, gets sick. And they got sick because they're living a terrible lifestyle. They're not eating good, they're not exercising, they're stressed all the time. And then they get sick, chas v'sholom. But that sickness becomes the wake-up call. And the person then changes everything. They realize, like, this, I'm not getting sick just for no reason. And they take it seriously. And from the trouble comes the healing. That's the wake-up call to, in a sense, force the person to change their ways. And so we could take that example in many, many, many different areas. But here, the juxtaposition of verses is Eve ate from the tree, and then immediately they realize that they're naked and they have to cover themselves out. So Rabbi Nehemiah learns, because of the juxtaposition, that if this is what caused their downfall, this is what will cause their rectification. So that's our first example. The next one is on the next page, 382. And this is from one of the stories about Avraham. And this is when he is in the area or the land of Avimelech. And when he went there, this was the second time that he requested from Sarah to say, "You are my sister." I see that bracha, I usually don't stop because I can't focus on the chats and same time, but bracha just put out that a vaccine in many cases is taking a little bit of the disease, injecting it into the body, so the body will create the antibodies. That's almost the basis of most vaccines. Now, there's new generations of vaccines, especially during COVID, we're seeing, but the classic vaccine is the trouble becomes the healing. And that is also the basis of homeopathy. Homeopathy also takes a little bit of what you want to get over, what you don't want to get, and distills it to such a fine, almost ethereal state, and that causes the healing. Okay, so back to Avimelech. And so Abraham requests from Sarah that she says that she's his sister, because Abraham is fearful that if they know that it's his wife. They'll kill him in order to take her. But in both cases, with Paro and with Avimelech, when they thought it was the sister, so then they took the sister. So it was, whichever way you cut it, it was a problematic situation. But what happens is, what's interesting, there are 10 dreams in the book of Bereshit. There are 10 dreams. And 9 of them, actually 8 of them occur to Jews, and 2 of them occur to non-Jews. And the first one is Avimelech. God comes to him in a dream and reveals to him the woman that you have just taken is not Avram's sister, it's his wife. And that Avram is a prophet, and you better return her immediately. And then it says that while this was happening, God shut up all of the wombs of all the people in the kingdom of Avimelech. Okay, he wakes up and he really does what God says. He tells the people, this is what happened. He returns Sarah. And then at the end, it says that Avram prayed for Avimelech and his kingdom that they should be able to have children again. And the next verse is, and God remembered Sarah, and she gave birth to Yitzhak. So in the Talmud, they see a juxtaposition here. It's not just stam that Avram prays for the people of Avimelech's kingdom to be able to have children. And the next verse is Sarah has children. So the Gemara learns a principle. And the principle is that if you need something, and someone else that you know needs the same thing, if you pray for them to be answered, you will be answered even before them. So, but there's one caveat, there's one stipulation, is that your prayer is sincere. Because if not, you would say, okay, I really don't care what happens to X, Y, or Z, but I want what I want. Therefore, I better pray for them first so I can get what I want. That is not the intent of the Talmud. The Talmud means that if you and someone else need something, and you have the big heart to pray for, that they're answered first, then you actually will be answered for what you want. And they learned this from the juxtaposition. And that's what it says in the Talmud, because this whole story is next to Sarah giving birth. That's how they learned that. Now later it says that the scoffers of the generation thought that Avimelech is the father of Yitzhak because of the juxtaposition. Oh, it just happens that Avimelech took Sarah, according to our tradition. He didn't take her sexually. He was planning on that, thinking it was Avram's sister. He knew the greatness of Avram, but he thought it was the sister. So they never had relations. But the scoffers said, oh, look at the juxtaposition of events here. And so therefore, Rashi tells us that Yitzhak looked exactly like Avram. And that when Yitzhak grew up, that people couldn't even tell the difference. And that's why it says that, in a sense, Avram was the first person to grow old. It says, Avram Zakein, Ba B'Yamim. That's why I mean, you still see it today. You see certain people who just don't look their age. And you ask them, how old are you? And they tell you what age it is. And it's like, whoa, like you look 20, 30 years younger than you are. I remember one time, it actually was on Purim, but this is not the reason. I hadn't drunk that much, but I saw one of kind of like our ex-students who used to come to our programs, and she was a little bit older then. And so I greeted her very warmly, and she was with another woman, and I said, who is your friend? And it turns out it was her mother. And her mother said, that's the best compliment I've had in years, that you thought I'm the same age as my daughter. But the truth is that they look the same age. I really couldn't tell. So they say that Avram was the first person who later became old, so people could distinguish between who was Avram and who was Yitzhak. Because for a long time, they looked exactly the same. And Rashi says this was because this was in order that the scoffers of the generation would not say Avimelech was the father. But all of this is from juxtaposition of verses and events. Okay, the next one also has to do with Yitzhak, also on page 382. And this is a short one, but it has many offshoots. And that is that it says that this is when Eliezer went to find a wife for Yitzhak, and he's coming back with Rivka. And as they're coming back, so the Torah says that Yitzhak came from the south, v'yetze Yitzhak l'suach b'sadeh, and Yitzhak went out to converse in the fields. So the word l'suach means to converse. That's why in modern Hebrew, a conversation is called a siach. L'suach is to have a conversation. But the sages understood, who is he conversing with? He was out in the field. He was conversing with God. And this is a type of prayer. This is really what we'll call it, the biblical source for the idea of hitbodedut. Here is Yitzhak going out to the field to converse with God. And so approximately 3,800 years ago, actually 3,800 years later, Rabbi Nachman makes hitbodedut a central pillar of his teachings. But here we see the biblical source. But what we want to get to here is the sages, there were two verses. The first verse says he came from the south. And the next verse says he went to pray in the field. And so, of course, part of prayer is being able to enunciate what we need, what we want, or it's an attempt to grow close to Hashem. And so it's considered that prayer is also connected to chachma, to wisdom. So from the juxtaposition of Yitzhak coming from the south and then praying in the field, so the rabbi said, anyone who wants to become wise, they should turn to the south. And then they said, anyone who wants to become wealthy should turn to the north. So what does this mean really? So here we do have a juxtaposition that the rabbi saw, that there's this connection of Yitzhak coming from the south. And also, he's the second of the patriarchs. Of course, he was wise. And he was praying. So but there's later we see another source for this, and that is in the Mishkan, in the temple, in the holy sanctuary. The menorah was placed on the south of the sanctuary, and the table of showbread was placed on the north. And this works exactly with this concept from the sages, because the menorah represents light, which represents wisdom. And the showbread represents sustenance, wealth. So because the showbread was in the north, the sages say, if you want to become wealthy, turn to the north in prayer. And you want to become wise, turn to the south in prayer. But there's even another connection, and this is to Avram. Because it says in the Torah that, let me think in the original. Oh, Avram halach. I hear my wife in the background. Avram halach v'nesoa hanegba. Avram, two words for travel. Halach v'nesoa hanegba. But what's hanegba? That is why we call the south of Israel the Negev, because Negev means south. And so it says Avram was traveling to the south. So it's explained in Chassidut. Well, why do we need to know that? Is because when we shake lulav, it actually doesn't even matter where we are. We always turn to the east, or at least in our mind, we're facing east. So that means the right is south, and the north is left. So the right is always Avraham, and the left is always Yitzhak. So in a sense, I'm not talking about geographically, but what does it mean that Yitzhak was coming from the south? He was coming from the tradition and the teachings of his father, who was always going to the south. And south, and we know that Avram is chesed. So here we see Yitzhak is coming from the south, even though we associate Yitzhak with Gevura. This would be a whole long thing, which I'm not going to get into right now, is if you really look at Yitzhak's life, it was full of chesed. And if you look at Abraham's life, it was full of gevura. And that's the balance. I'll mention this because this week we're starting the week of Tiferet in Sfirat HaOmer. And Tiferet is the balance between chesed and gevura come together in Tiferet. And so here you see it's a very deep thing that Avram, who is chesed, but if you look at his life, his challenges were with gevura. And Yitzhak is gevura, and his challenges was with chesed. So all of this is just the juxtaposition of why does the Torah have to tell us that Yitzhak was coming from the south? Other than the fact that that's part of the storyline. He was physically in the south, but the Torah is very sparse with its words. Technically, it didn't have to tell us that. The fact that it told us that is connected to this idea that the sages developed about, if you want to be wise, turn to the south. The next one is on page 385. This is really a very, 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 very good one that most people would not make the connection with. And it was actually pointed out by Rabbi Ginsburg. The Shema appears in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, in the Parsha of Ve'et Hanan. And it's the beginning of what's called the sixth Aliyah. On Shabbat, we divide not just on Shabbat, but in Chumash, we divide every week's portion into 7 readings, 7 sections. So the beginning of the 6th section of this parsha is the Shema. But what's the last verse of the previous reading? In other words, what's the verse that comes before Shema? And many people don't catch this because when it's publicly read on Shabbat, you end the reading at the end of the 5th section, and then you start the 6th, and there's an after bracha and another pre-bracha. So you don't see the juxtaposition so much. But the verse before it talks about the land of Israel being a land flowing with milk and honey. This verse is repeated many times in the Chumash. The description of the land of Israel being a land of flowing with milk and honey. We're told that that the honey is not bee honey, it is date honey. It's date honey. So Rav Ginsburg says if you take out the word flowing and you just have a land of milk and honey, it's Eretz Chalav Davash. So what's the first letters? Aleph of Eretz, Chet of Chalav, Dalet of Davash. It spells Echad. And then the very next, Echad meaning one. The very next verse is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And so Rav Ginsburg puts this together, and it just makes a statement, but I'll show the other statements that go along with this, is the idea that the revelation of God's oneness, which is everywhere, but it's most pronounced in the land of Israel, in the land flowing with milk and honey. So not how do we know this? We'll call it supports for this, is the sages made a pretty radical statement. And they said, anyone who does not live in Israel, it's as if they don't have a God. Now, this is a very strong statement, very strong, but there are many strong statements by the sages that are meant to teach something. And they say someone who lives in Eretz Israel is like someone who has a God. What are they trying to point out? That there is a qualitative difference in, we'll call it feeling, of being in Israel and not being in Israel, having to do with our relationship and our experience of godliness. And I'm just going to share for myself, for everyone's different now. Once someone came to the Tzemach Tzedek, the 3rd Rebbe of Chabad, and asked for a bracha to go to Eretz Yisrael. And Chabad was very supportive of people coming to Israel. and the Baal Shem Tov tried to come to Israel. The Alter Rebbe was actually on his way to Israel at one point, and then the Rabbi Menachem Mendel of the Vitebsk, who at that point the Maggid of Mezrich had passed away, and almost all of the students of the Maggid took on Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk as their Rebbe, including the Alter Rebbe. And Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk brought a few hundred families to Israel in the late 1700s. And this, even though in Zionist history, they called the first Aliyah in the 1880s. But it's not true. Really, in the late 1700s, hundreds of families came with the Rebbe of Vitebsk, and they settled in Tiberias and Sfat. And also the students of the Vilna Gaon, many of them came to Israel. And almost all of them settled in what are called the four holy cities of Israel: Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tiberias, and Sfat. And so anyways, this man comes to the Tzemach Tzedek and asks for a bracha to come to Israel, and he wouldn't give it to him, because he just felt for this particular person, it wouldn't be good. And the man was like heartbroken. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, make Eretz Yisrael here. In other words, there is the physical Eretz Yisrael, but you can take Eretz Yisrael with you. So I want to share, I came to Israel in 1974. And the first time I went back was in 1977. And I was in the States for 3 months. And I had become so attached to Eretz Yisrael, I could hardly pray for those whole 3 months. It wasn't like on purpose. It just like, I just felt like a fish out of water. And that was only after being in Israel for 3 years. I just felt like a fish out of water. And then we went back again in 1988, after I was here 12 years. And there we ended up spending 7 years. And it was a very good 7 years. But I have to say, I also felt like a fish out of water those whole 7 years also, even though it was very good years. But once Avram is sharing, Rabbi Nachman said, Rabbi Nachman came to Israel for 9 months. And then he went back. And anytime anyone asked him, where are you going? He would say, I'm always going to Eretz Yisrael. So this is all to explain the juxtaposition of Shema Yisrael, which is the principal statement of faith, with this idea of a land flowing with milk and honey. And the other one is, we're going to actually get to it later in 70 Faces, but every day in Shachrit and Kedusha, we say, Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimakomo. Blessed is the glory of God from his place. So the question is, well, what is God's place? Where is God's place? And so this is also a tremendous chiddush from Rav Ginsburg. If you take the words Kavod Hashem, Kavod equals 32. The four-letter name of God equals 26. 32 times 26 equals 832 equals Eretz Yisrael. So when you read, blessed is the glory of God from his place, you can read it, even though we might think God's place is like somewhere way up in the heavens. But this teaching is it's right here in Eretz Israel. That is where the glory of God is most pronounced. It is everywhere, because this statement is Ezekiel hearing the angels saying, Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimakomo. So from their perspective, it's like God is way up there in angel territory. But for us, it's most pronounced in Eretz Israel. Okay. Now the next one is like a very practical one. This is it's on page 386, and this is taken from Parshat Shoftim, where it describes that before Israel would go to war, so one of the officers would encourage everyone, but then they pronounced anyone who has built a new house but hasn't had a chance to live in it yet, he can go back. In other words, it's like, it would be heartbreaking. You spend years and all of your savings and you build a house, and then the war comes and you didn't even have a chance to live in it. So he has an exemption from going to war. And then it says anyone who's planted a vineyard and has not yet redeemed it, has not yet had any benefit from it, he is exempt from going to war. And the third one is someone is engaged to be married, but isn't married yet. He's also exempt. So the sages learn from the juxtaposition, the order of these verses. First, it says a house, then it says a vineyard, and then it says being married. So the sages learn that this is a teaching that when a person wants to get married, he first should make sure that he and his wife are going to have some place to live, that he has not just a vineyard, but he has a means of sustenance, and then he should get married. So it's just like from the juxtaposition of the verses, they learn what we'll call practical advice. It's not like a halacha, but you see this happens sometimes when you have people are young, they fall in love, they want to get married immediately. And sometimes because they don't have their like physical trip together, then they're starting off like kind of like in a rough position. So here the sages were just saying, this is a good advice as to the order of how you should do things. Okay, now we're going to go to 387. And this is a very, very interesting one. And it's a long one. So this comes from a teaching from Rav Ginsburg. And it's a different type of juxtaposition. What we've been doing is verses pretty much right next to each other, one right after the other. But Rav Ginsburg said there are many verses in the Tanakh that he called soulmates. It's a very, very interesting idea, meaning the juxtaposition isn't, let's say, physical. They're not one verse next to another, but the theme or the words of the verse are like a soulmate with another verse. It could be in a completely different book in the Tanakh. So we're going to go through some of these because they're very interesting. And just by learning this concept, it can make us aware that when we're reading the Torah, it's like, oh, there's a very similar type of verse somewhere else. There must be some connection. Okay, so the first one is, we say this every morning in Mizmor LaToda, a psalm of thanksgiving, Psalm 100. We say, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, bo lefanav birnana. Serve God with joy, come before him in gladness. So that's a verse we say every day. A slightly less known verse from the second psalm starts exactly the same way. Ivdu et Hashem, but instead of b'simcha, it's b'yira. V'gilu b'ra'ada. So here it's serve God with awe or fear and rejoice with trembling. So Rav Ginsburg says these two verses he calls them soulmates because they complement each other. And obviously the wording is very similar. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, Ivdu et Hashem b'yira. And here, they might seem like opposites, but we can see them as being complementary. That serving God with joy is complemented by serving God with awe or tremendous respect. So that's the first one. And we see it in the structure of the verses that they're juxtaposed, they're complementary. The next one, I'm going to jump down because this is a very, very known one. This is from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. One verse says, now this is in the same book, and so it's really, really juxtaposed. In one place it says, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, haro'eh b'shoshanim. I am to my beloved, and my beloved is mine. He shepherds among the lilies or roses. And then it says also, Dodi li v'ani lo, haro'eh b'shoshanim. So the first one is, I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. And the second one is, my beloved is to me, and I am to my beloved. So these are obviously when Shlomo Melech composed Shir HaShirim, he was very, very aware of the mirror image he was setting up here. The complementary or the juxtaposed ideas here. And this is a classic case of what we call awakening from above and awakening from below. Because in the first one, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, is the awakening is coming from, when we say below, it means from us, from human beings to God. Because we know that the whole of Shir HaShirim is an allegory of the love between God and Israel. So when it says, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, it's as if we're making the first step. We are expressing our love first. And the other one, it's Dodi li v'ani lo. Here, the awakening is coming from above. We become aware of God's love for us. And then we're motivated to return that love. So here, this is very explicit as two verses that are juxtaposed, call them soulmates, call them complementary. On the top of the page, so this is also very, very similar to what we said. One verse, it's in Tehillim 104. Yehi chavod Hashem le'olam yismach Hashem b'ma'asav. We say this every morning in Psukei de Zimra. May the glory of God endure forever. Let God rejoice in his works. And as here, the verse is expressing that we would get great joy if we knew that God gets joy from the world that he created. So this is a very beautiful concept in itself. It's in a love relationship, there's what I want and what gives me joy. But then there's what gives me joy is when my beloved is happy. That's what gives me joy. So that's what we're expressing here, that the glory of God should endure forever. And let God rejoice in his works, in his deeds, his creation. So the complementary verse is very similar. Yismach Yisrael be'osav, b'nei Tzion yagilu b'malkam. So here it's a mirror image. Here it's let Israel be joyous in God's deeds. And the children of Sion rejoice in their king. So here in one, we're hoping that God has joy from his creation. And here we want to get joy from God's creation. So here we see again a very, very complementary idea. And the last one, and this will be the last one of the evening. So this is also, it's on the bottom of page 388. So the first one is from the book of Devarim. Va'atem hadevekim ba'Hashem Elokechem chayim kulchem hayom. Those of you that cling to God, your God, you are all alive this day. So we actually say that when we take out the Torah for a public reading, and we put it on the bima, the bama, where we read it. So we say this verse: "Tema devekim Hashem Elokechem chayim kulchem hayom." Now, what's the complementary verse? So you'll see it's very, very similar. This is the first verse of Parshat Nitzavim. This parsha is always read the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, always. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. The order is different, but the words are virtually the same, except instead of clinging, it's standing. One says, those of you who are clinging to God, you are all alive. And here it says, all of you are standing today before God. Both of them say today, both of them say all of you, and begin with atem. So they're very, very, very similar. And this is the source of the very, very important concept called devekut, which means to cling or cleave to God. And the Slonim Rebbe in the Tivot Shalom actually says many times that the purpose of all of the mitzvot is that we should come to cleave, cling, be one with, unite with God. He says this many, many, many times, that the purpose of all of the mitzvot, we'll call it to come close, but it's more than to come close. It's to be one with, to cling to God. And so the word v'atem hadevekim, so that's the concept called devekut, of wanting to become one with God, clinging to God. Now, this verse that begins Parshat Nitzavim, so if any of you have the book Orchard of Delights, and you go to Parshat Nitzavim, there's a whole long Torah about this one verse. This is one of the most pregnant verses in the Torah. There is so much here. We don't really have time to go into it. But again, the idea here is that these two verses are very, very similar. And the fact that we read, and you are standing today, all of you before God, being a soulmate with the verse about clinging to God, and we read this right before Rosh Hashanah. So this is like paves the way for us to have the right headspace, the right attitude going into the 10 days of Tshuva, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. So I'll end with a bracha. And the bracha is that we could really do what the Slonim Rebbe says, that the purpose of all of the mitzvot is to cling to Hashem. Now, halavai, we would remember that every time we get up to pray, every time we eat something, every time we do a mitzvah, every time we make a bracha. But what we are being told is that every single one of those opportunities is an opportunity to cling to Hashem, to become one with Hashem at that moment. At that moment, even a short bracha that takes 3 seconds to say, but if our kavana is wanting to cling to Hashem, that simple bracha, this time we'll put in the apple. we said the apple was not the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but if we're saying a bracha on an apple, it's actually quite mind-blowing that we could actually cling to God at that moment if our consciousness is there, if that's what we want to accomplish with that bracha. So I give us a blessing that at least some of the time, we're human beings and no pretenses of being tzaddikim here, but if at least sometimes we could really, really take the opportunity, every mitzvah, every bracha. You know, when you really feel it a lot is Seder night. Like everything you do has like so much importance, has so much symbolism, so much kavana, that a lot of people really could relate to this. It's just like everything you do, every little thing is like, wow, this is another opportunity to cling to Hashem. Okay.